This original WSRE presentation is made possible by viewers like you. Thank you.
A look at the Vietnam War through the eyes of children. Documentary filmmaker Jill Hubbs on this edition of Conversations. Much has been written and produced about the Vietnam War, but often overlooked are the emotional wounds suffered by the children of those who were killed or missing in action. In her documentary, They Were Our Fathers, filmmaker Jill Hubbs chronicles stories of children in search of hope, answers, and perhaps closure. For Hubbs, the film is more than a project. It's a personal mission. Her own father went missing off the coast of North Vietnam when she was 10 years old. The former elementary school teacher has produced an impressive array of documentaries over the years, among them Gulf Coast War Memories, Honor Flight, A Journey of Heroes, Gulf Islands National Seashore, The Treasure of the Gulf Coast, and Baseball in Pensacola. In addition, Hubbs has spent 2 decades as Education and Outreach Director for PBS affiliate WSRE TV. We welcome Jill Hubbs to Conversations. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Jeff.
Why make this documentary?
It's a story I've wanted to tell for a long time. My father is still missing in action in Vietnam, and so I have known others through the years that, as an adult that I met that had such fascinating stories and stories I felt like needed to be told. So I just felt like it needed to be done. It was time.
It was time. Tell me about your dad.
My dad was a Navy pilot who actually came to Pensacola and to go to flight training. Met my mother, and as the story goes for many naval aviators, and that's how our family began. And he was a career Navy. He had been to Vietnam twice, and he was on his second tour of duty when he was lost and became missing in Vietnam.
We talked about at the beginning, this is a very personal story, and we want to play a clip and let folks kind of get an idea and a feel for what this documentary is all about.
My father, Navy Commander Donald Richard Hubbs, was commanding officer of VS-23, the world-famous Black Cats, stationed aboard the USS Yorktown in the Gulf of Tonkin during the Vietnam War. It was his second tour of duty in Vietnam. On March 17, 1968, my father was piloting an S-2E Tracker reconnaissance aircraft on a mission off the coast of North Vietnam. The airplane disappeared off the radar, and my father and his crew became missing in action. No trace of the aircraft or the men was ever found. During the decade that followed, our family identified a picture of a POW as my father. In 1987, we received a live sighting report from the Defense Intelligence Agency stating that their credible witness claimed to have seen my dad being held with other American prisoners near the city of Dalat. And finally, in 1993, I traveled to Vietnam myself to see what I could learn about my father's fate. In Hanoi, I discovered a Vietnamese grave registration with my father's name listed on it. Yet to this day, my father remains missing and unaccounted for. His name is etched on panel 45E, line 12 of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Growing up, I did not know anyone else who had lost their father in the Vietnam War, much less anyone else whose dad was missing in action. The war was unpopular, and many people did not treat those who served or their families with kindness or respect. In addition to coping with the loss and grief, growing up having lost my father in Vietnam left me feeling different from everyone else and isolated. But then, in the early 1990s, I read a Parade magazine article about a group called Sons and Daughters in Touch. And finally, I met boys and girls, now men and women, who grew up with the same experiences as me.
Very, very powerful, and as we mentioned, it was very personal for you. What was it like when you were a child and you heard about what had happened to your father?
Well, at the time, I don't really think as a child I understood that we were at war, because my dad was on deployments all the time, and so it was kind of business as usual. And even when he became missing, my mom told us, well, they're looking for him. So I, as a child, I felt like, well, they'll find him. But days turned into weeks and weeks into months, and before we knew it, months into years. So the reality set in, after a while, that they couldn't find him. And, the war was, there were so many questions at that time about the war, and there really wasn't a definitive list of who was a prisoner of war. And so that was our hope, that he had been taken as prisoner of war, and when the war ended, that he would come back. So I can remember Operation Homecoming, which when the POWs came back, there was about over 500 that had been kept at the Hanoi Hilton and other places. And we watched on TV, as they came off the plane, just hoping that my dad would be one of them, and it just wasn't meant to be.
Yeah. How did your mother deal with it?
My mother's a very strong woman. Now that I'm an adult, I realize the heartache and the heartbreak that she must have felt, and then she had to fulfill the roles of mother and father for us. But she was a very strong woman, and she did what she thought my dad would want her to do. He was commanding officer of the squadron, so she followed the Navy protocol, and we did what we were expected to do. But as time went on, she wanted answers, and she reached out to a lot of different leaders in our country, and even foreign leaders, to trying to get help to see what could be done, especially before the prisoners came home, and no one really knew for sure who was being held as a POW.
What is the status of it today?
Just as they did for many families, because there was no new information. Originally he was missing in action. Now status has changed to killed in action, body not recovered, but with no new information. They are still completely missing and unaccounted for. No trace of my dad's plane or any of the crew members. He was with 3 crew members, was ever found. So I think we have just as many questions today as we did in 1968.
Is anyone within the government or anyone within the military, are they trying to continue to follow up, or has it been a closed case?
No, I have a Navy casualty officer. They do a case review from time to time. They've asked us in the last couple of years for DNA, which made me wonder, well, perhaps, have they found something? Remains are returned all the time. There is an organization over there, it's Americans, it used to be called the Joint JPAC, the Joint Pacific Accounting Command, that actually does the research and does excavations and of crash sites and that kind of thing to recover remains and to bring that closure to families. So, there is the hope that one day maybe something will be found, but I think after a while, it's been 48 years, you just have to come to accept that you may never know.
Yeah. For young people watching this program right now who were not alive or were too young to remember what it was like during the Vietnam era, in recent years when our military men and women have gone off to the various conflicts and whatnot, they've come back to a hero's welcome.
Right.
That was not the case.
Not at all.
Yeah.
In Vietnam, the soldiers were scorned, and I had a lot of people that served in Vietnam that said they came back, and in the airports they took their uniforms off because they did not want anyone to realize that they were veterans, there just was no support for the troops. Thank goodness it's changed now. People may not agree with the war, but they support our military members, for doing the job that they're sent to do.
As a young person, did you realize what was going on from that standpoint, the negativity, or were you too young?
To begin with, I was too young. Like I said, I really didn't even understand, I think, that we were at war. But as time went on, there was a big push in the United States to get the humane treatment of our prisoners of war. There were reports of them being tortured and inhumane conditions and that kind of thing. And I remember we were living in San Diego, California at the time, and I remember sitting outside of Save-On drugstore, and we were trying to, as a lot of families were and a lot of Americans were, getting people to sign petitions to send to Hanoi for the humane treatment of our prisoners. And giving out bumper stickers and that kind of thing. So I was there with my mom and some other families, and I remember somebody stopping at the table and telling us, well, your father's a murderer. You know, it was a different atmosphere then, a completely different atmosphere than it is today,
Right,
which
right.
is a good thing that it's
Right.
changed for, you know.
Absolutely. When do you think the tide turned? I mean, because when do you think people realized, boy, that was a mistake to blame the men who were over there fighting? It was blame politicians all day. But when do you think that tide changed in this country?
Hard to say, but I even think that, you know, it had something to do with the veterans themselves who came home and went on with their lives, but still bore the scars of Vietnam, the way they were treated and just the things they experienced. And I think Vietnam veterans are more vocal about it now too, and people have come to realize that, you know, it's our government is the one that actually starts wars, not the soldiers, and they go and do a job that they're told to do.
Right.
And you know, with Iraq and Afghanistan, people are just not as, a lot of people feel like we shouldn't be there, but they do support the troops, and it's a good thing to see that the tide has turned that way.
Yeah, absolutely. When you visited Vietnam, what was that like?
I went to Vietnam in 1993 after we had tried everything else, you know, to get information about my dad. And by that time, we'd had a live sighting report where the Defense Intelligence Agency came to us and said, you know, their credible witness claimed to have seen my father in Dalat. And he actually passed a piece of paper to whoever this was, and it had my grandmother's address on it here in Pensacola.
Wow.
You know, it had almost been 20 years since my dad had been lost. And at the time, the military told us the same thing that they had told us when my father was first missing. Don't talk about it because you might endanger him. But they changed his status by then. And so as an adult, I said to my mom, I think we need to speak up and see what we can find, ask questions. And so we went to Washington, D.C. to the Senate Select Committee hearings that they had on POWs and MIAs, and, you know, really delved into my dad's case. And then going to Vietnam was kind of just a last option. I had an opportunity to go with someone who was a small group called Friendship Force, and they were going over to Vietnam for the first time in the name of friendship to Hanoi and then also to Saigon. And, you know, we actually didn't have normalized relations, the United States and Vietnam, so my mother really didn't want me to go. She felt like it was dangerous, which after I got there, I realized she could be right. But I just felt like it was something I had to try. And I ended up meeting with the JPAC, the Americans that do all the searching, and they went over my dad's case in great depth. And then they told me about a grave registration that they had. It was a Vietnamese document, an old document, that had my dad's name listed as being buried in the Quang Binh province, which at that point, the Vietnamese had always claimed they had no knowledge of my dad or his crew. He had 3 crew members. And so that was a new piece of information. And, you know, I think it probably led to more questions than answers, but it's another piece of the puzzle.
Tell me how making the film, how did that come about?
I have belonged to this group called Sons and Daughters in Touch for 25 years. The first gathering was in 1992, and I did read about it in a Parade magazine article. And so I went to Washington, D.C. with my mother and my daughter, Sarah, who was about 10 years old at the time, and we decided to go. And, you know, my mom saw the wall for the first time, and so the idea was to meet on Father's Day. And there was you know, a considerably large group. I mean, and I had never met anybody else whose dad had even been killed in Vietnam, much less other people who had someone missing. So I've known a lot of these people for 25 years. You know, we've become friends. That particular time, the very first time, everyone shared stories, and it was like, gosh, they were telling my story. I'd listen to someone and I'm like, that happened to us too. You know, it was the same exact thing. And I heard some really powerful stories over the years, and I just, and it's also a beautiful thing that we do on Father's Day at the wall. You know, Father's Day, none of us had celebrated Father's Day. for decades. And it's a beautiful thing that we do. And I just felt like it was a story that needed to be told. I think people forget there's a cost to war beyond just the war. There's a cost to the families, and sometimes there's wounds that don't heal. And I just felt like I wanted to share the story.
Explain what goes on at the wall on Father's Day.
Well, everyone comes together, and one of the first things that we're able to do is go to the wall very early on a Saturday morning before Father's Day, and around 5 a.m. and wash the wall. Now, that's with the blessing of the National Park Service. They don't just let anyone come in and do it, but it's, and when that may not sound like anything, exciting to do or whatever, it's a very reverent experience, because everyone washes their own dad's panel, and it's just a bonding kind of a thing. The wall is completely stripped. There's nothing there, and we get it cleaned and ready for Father's Day, but it's a very special experience. And then we do sharing circles where people share their stories. There's a candlelight vigil at the wall at night. And then on Father's Day, we have a nice ceremony where everyone comes together, and then we leave roses for our dads. And it's a red rose if your father was killed in action, yellow if he's missing, as mine is, and then white roses for those who came home but maybe died later from their injuries or illnesses. Mm-hmm. So by the time the ceremony is over, the wall is completely covered in roses, and it is a beautiful sight.
I can imagine. Jill, as you were putting together the film and talking with other folks, were you surprised at some of the stories you heard?
Yes. I've known many of these people for years now, and some actually for this film were new friends, but I knew some of their stories, but turning the cameras on them and letting them share their memories and the stories of their dads and their feelings about what happened, and was very emotional for them, but it was for me too. Just as they told their stories, the same thing. I could relate to everything they were saying because I lived it too. And I learned more in depth, though, than some of the stories. One of my friends, Elaine Roach, lives in California, and I met her the first year. And she actually came with her son, who was about 10 years old, the very first time. And her dad was a Navy pilot, and I knew that. But as I was interviewing her and she's telling the story, she shares that her father flew an S-2. And I didn't interrupt the interview, but I'm like, oh my gosh, that's the plane my dad flew, which was the only S-2 lost in Vietnam that I knew about. And I knew they had to know each other. I knew that they probably knew each other. So I waited till the end of the interview and shared that with her. So her dad was actually killed. He'd flown combat missions. He was on the USS Kearsarge. And he'd flown combat missions, and he was actually giving a younger pilot some night hours, so it was a training mission, and they flew off the deck and the plane crashed and they were killed. There was 3 of them killed. And when she came in 92, just like everybody else, she was looking for her dad's name on the wall. It was the first time she'd been there, and her father's name was not on the wall. And because of a technicality, he crashed 3 degrees outside the combat zone. And one thing I hope from this film is maybe this will help the awareness of that. I feel like that's an injustice. Her dad, sure. His name should be on the wall.
Sure.
But then she had a son, Joel, that I met the very first time, and he grew up and became a man, and he joined the Army. And long story short, he was killed in Iraq. And so she's a Gold Star daughter and a Gold Star mother, and her story is just so touching. Yeah. There's another friend of mine, Colleen Shine, who actually went to Vietnam herself and discovered her own father's crash site wreckage that had identification marks on it, and met a villager who had a helmet, and when she turned the helmet over, her father's name was written inside. Because of that, going there and finding that, eventually his remains were excavated and returned. But if she hadn't gone, they had told her everything had been done. So, maybe that story would have turned out different. Maybe she'd still be wondering like I do. Right. And then, of course, Tony Cordero, who actually founded Sons and Daughters in Touch, he has a unique story and an interesting story of his own, too. And, so I knew so many of these stories. I just felt like this has got to be shared with other people. It's a story that really hasn't been told in a way that anyone understands.
Yeah. You mentioned Gold Star mother and Gold Star daughter. For folks who don't know, what is a Gold Star mother or daughter?
A Gold Star is a designation. It's really an act of Congress, and it was started in World War II. The families hung flags in the window, blue stars. If you had one blue star, it was a flag with a red border and blue stars. One blue star meant you had one son serving in the military. If you had two, and so on. If the son was killed, then the star changed from blue to gold, indicating that was a family that had suffered a loss during time of war. And so that's a designation that is given to families who have lost someone serving our country and in time of war. And, I'm actually wearing my little Gold Star pin that was given to me. And it's just a designation that indicates you've suffered a loss.
Right. Fascinating story talking about Elaine. I mean, that just incredible. How does she cope with the situation?
It's hard. It's very hard. She's suffered wounds from two different wars, and not just her dad, and then not growing up with her dad, but then her own son. It's difficult, and she cried during the interview, and I did too. Oh, it's a difficult thing to deal with, and her story is unique, but all these stories, even though they're different, there's a common thread for all of us, and I think that it was important to share those stories.
You said, and when I watched the documentary, a couple of the other participants also said, as a child you felt different, I guess ostracized or something along those lines, perhaps, or
maybe not ostracized, but just I didn't know anybody else that had lost their dad in Vietnam. And back then, that was the 60s, almost everybody had a mom and a dad. It was different, there weren't the family relationships like there are as common today, where there was broken families, So and the fact that nobody knew where my dad was, and it was just hard to explain, so it was just difficult as a child. You don't want to feel different than anybody else when you're a kid, and that was a common thing that many of us, when we started sharing our stories, everybody felt like that. We just didn't know. There was no support for families back then, like there is now. When you lost someone during war, you basically were on your own. Some of the families talked about they had to leave. They were living on the base, and they had to leave within a week, or whatever. So there was just no resources or support like families today experience.
Right. How did you cope with it as a child?
One day at a time. Yeah. I don't think I really understood like I do now.
Right.
I wonder how my mother coped,
Right.
Just the living in limbo and not knowing. As I said, she was a very strong woman, but, now looking back on it as an adult, I realize, that she had a difficult journey.
I know your mom has passed, but in the latter years of her life, did the two of you have a deep conversation about it?
We talked about it from time to time. It was painful for her, and I knew that, so we didn't bring it up all the time. But just the not ever knowing, and then just the things that, like the live sighting report and some of the other, pieces of the puzzle that were incomplete. It's just one of those things a wound that really never healed, and I know that was difficult for her.
Tell me here, as we get into the final minutes of the program, tell me about Sons and Daughters in Touch.
Sons and Daughters is a unique organization. It was started by the Sons and Daughters, and we have about 1,000 members that live all over the United States. They come from all different kinds of backgrounds, and they represent every branch of the military. And as I mentioned, all the stories are different, but there's very common threads. But about 20,000 children lost their dads in the Vietnam War. So there's many more sons and daughters out there that don't know about the organization, would probably appreciate the support, getting to know some of the other sons and daughters, sharing their story. And if nothing else, it's just the legacy of our fathers, honoring our dads. I'm sure there's many that would like to join us at the wall in Washington, D.C. on Father's Day and pay respects to their dads. What
do you hope people take away from the film?
I hope that, first of all, there's an awareness that we may find other sons and daughters. One wish of mine is that Elaine's dad will get his name on the wall. That would make me very happy, just the awareness of her story being shared. And then, it was done out of respect to her dads and to honor their legacy. So I wanted to share a story that I felt like was important to tell.
Yeah, you're a former school teacher. I mean, you have to, and you told it in such a way that, I mean, it is a great history lesson. Should be played in some classrooms. You narrated the film yourself.
Yes.
Why did you do that? It was phenomenal, but I mean, was that the plan all along, or was it?
No, to begin with, I wasn't going to be in it at all. But I wanted to capture everything, but I wasn't going to be in it. And then Ted King and James Roy from WSRE went with me to Washington to film everything, and James is the one who really talked me into, telling it from my perspective. Yeah. And now I'm glad that I did, but because it is my story too.
Yeah. Well, that's the reason I ask that, because with you telling the story and narrating the film, it just adds something extra special to it, and it's extremely moving. I watched it, and very, very well done. And like I said, it's a history lesson. I think you guys have done a phenomenal job.
Well, thank you very much. It was an honor to do it and to preserve the legacy of our dads and to honor them.
Yeah. It's a documentary entitled "They Were Our Fathers." Jill Hubbs is the filmmaker who brought it all together. Had the opportunity to sit down and watch it, and I can tell you that it is educational. You will learn an awful lot, but it's also very powerful, and it's very emotional. Nice piece of work, very nice piece of work. They Were Our Fathers, the name of the documentary produced by Jill Hubbs. By the way, you can find some of Jill's other documentaries, as well as some of our conversations, online at WSRE.org. We are also on Facebook and on YouTube. I'm Jeff Weeks. Thank you so very much for watching. I hope you enjoy the broadcast. Take wonderful care of yourself, and we'll see you soon.
Support for this program is provided in part by these corporate sponsors. And by viewers like you.